Oh, interesting. All right, so Dave is coming around with the handout for session 2. Even if you got one last week, take one of this week's because last week's was missing a page. If you took a session 2 handout last week, I mistakenly made a copy that did not have the 3rd page. So you were working on shorter material. Up here I've got another copy of the reading schedule. I've got last week's handout. I've got next week's handout. So we got lots of papers for you. A lot of trees have given their lives to support this effort here, and we appreciate that. We honor that. So a couple of things to get us started, to reintroduce some of last week's material, and if you missed last week, get you up to speed. I'm going to reread some of the data, page 18. Because last week we just kind of kissed on the whole Martin Luther side of this, but we're really looking primarily these first couple of weeks at mental health. Dave's got the handouts for today, coming around with them. Those are next week.
Okay.
That's last week. Dave, session 2 is what you need. Dave's got it.
You said last
3 is next week.
Last week wasn't complete, right?
Right, the session 2. This is next week.
Okay. I'll just sit there. Sorry.
All right, Dave's got today's. Anybody need one from Dave? There you go. Balancias are going to need one. Well, except, so last week's handout, it's my mistake. Session 2 should have 3 pages to it. If you got it last week, it only had 2 pages to it because I had mistakenly not made a copy of the 3rd page. So you need a session 2 that includes 3 pages. If the first page is front and back, you're all set. If the first page is not front and back, you need one of the handouts Dave's got. All right, very good. That was easy, right? Won't make that mistake again. Next week's handouts are up here, and as far as I'm aware, they're correct. I'll remind everybody at the end of the session. So last week was really, we haven't really come up with a definition yet for what is mental illness or what are mental health problems or diagnoses. Last week we really looked at the prevalence of the problem, which makes sense to me. Why are we talking about this? Is this significant enough to talk about? So page 18 had a little chart that we referenced. So annually, best estimate of annual prevalence rates. So any disorder, 21% of American adults will deal with any mental disorder in a given year. If you remember, once they compiled that, over 50% of American adults will deal with some sort of diagnosable mental disorder during the course of their lifetime. Anxiety is by far the highest at 19, major depression a little over 8, serious mental illness 5.6. So what we talked about last week is even just in a room this size, either somebody's dealing with it or somebody has dealt with it. Certainly somebody's loved ones are dealing with it or have dealt with it. So it's extremely common. But what is it? That's what we're going to get into more today. Last week we talked, I should explain, by the way, I'm John Rao this week. Actually, no, I'm the substitute. So John was going to teach, we met, we went over everything. John and Lene's son, Kevin, had to be out of the dorms down in Virginia this week. He'd been staying down while he was job hunting. Came down with some sort of nasty virus toward the end of the week. So they went down to help him, and I let them know it's totally fine. So sorry that you're stuck with me as a substitute, but fortunately I was at least ready for the material. So, and then next week we'll be continuing on. Dan and I will be teaching, so that's going to go well, I'm sure. So let's work this week towards a definition of mental health problems, of mental illness. This week what we did was chapter 2 and chapter 6 cover some of the same material, and perhaps Saunders, the author, was intending that to be repetitious. Repetition is the mother of all learning, right? So maybe it's on purpose, but given our format, it certainly seemed to make more sense, God bless you, that we would combine these. And we're not going to look at a lot from chapter 6 except that material that was unique to chapter 6. However, as I go through this stuff, if there were quotes, I know a lot of us at this point have the text. I know some of you are able to read it, if I'm skipping something you wanted to discuss, either you think he did a great job of making this point, you didn't like this point, you were confused by this point, feel free. I will try to remember as we go along section by section to do that. But the format here for chapter 2 is to basically, we're going to define a bunch of terms, and then that kind of concludes with defining mental health problems, defining mental illness, and then a bit more discussion, which we started last week, about some of the stigma that can surround these things. So we're going to define emotions, behavior, thinking, roles and relationships. We're going to look at how they all interplay, and then all of those terms are going to be used by one of the clinically accepted definitions for what is a diagnosable mental illness. All right, so we're going to do a lot of reading. I'm just going to go around the room, and if you don't like reading publicly for any reason at all, totally fine, just say pass. It'll just save us a little time rather than asking for volunteers. So I'm going to start with you, Miss Bev, in about 30 seconds. So get ready. That's your warning. Because seeing you reminded me, we talked about diagnostics last week. A couple of things to tag on. So if anybody would like to see, Bev has a copy. The Diagnostics and Statistics Manual was referenced. This is DSM-3. They're up to DSM-5 now. But any given issue, so here's anxiety disorder. So this would be the diagnostic criteria for obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm not going to start the list because if anybody deals with it, I'd have to read the whole list. But everyone, sorry.
Maybe more than one
Not helpful. My apologies. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I did have a chance to interact with Laura Merrick, who's the member here, and she's a licensed clinical social worker. I gave her a copy of the text. She's been working through it. She sent some comments. And the one thing that she wanted to clarify, last week we talked about this a little bit, that if you recall, like it talked about there might be 9 criteria for this diagnosis, and if you've got 5 of them, you're clinically diagnosed, but if you're 4, then you're not. We talked about how that could be unnecessarily sort of pedantic. But one of the things she wanted to reassure is that every caregiver is aware that there are issues that aren't going to quite fit the diagnostics or the lists. There are ways to code things, and really what it comes down to, and we talked about this a little bit last week, is insurance. If you haven't coded it as something, then insurance isn't going to help cover it. So if you're receiving care, insurance is going to want to see a clinical diagnosis. That's what drives some of this, and that's fair. But be aware that, especially with DSM-5, they have some other kind of categories where this is a clinician saying, yes, this deserves clinical attention and help. It doesn't fully fit any of the definitions in here. And she really wanted to reassure you that for diagnostics, for insurance companies, there may need to be a stark dividing line. Providers are very familiar with the fact that humans are unique, every single individual. They're going to try to find you ways to get the help that you need to get. So wanted to pass that on as well. All right, now Bev, over to you, unless you're passing, in which case we'll start to, can you read the first quote for us as we start to work toward a definition of emotions, which is also called affect?
Emotions or feelings are generally negative or positive. We have a mix of feelings throughout every day. Emotions usually change from moment to moment. The intensity of emotions also varies. Our emotions are central to our identity. As how we feel about things is perhaps what most defines us. Physically, all persons are nearly identical, with similar cells, bones, organs, and biological processes. We differ, however, in whom we like and love, what we dislike and despise. Our emotions make us who we are. If you want to make someone feel bad, mock or invalidate their emotions. Okay. Thus, the essence of love and compassion is to respect and even appreciate another person's emotions.
There's a lot contained here, and so I just want to open it up for discussion. Now, there's a lot of ... so I'm kind of compressing some paragraphs here in the quote that Marcus read. Thank you, Marcus. What are people's thoughts on this particular take towards emotions? Ms. Beth.
I don't have my book with me, but there was one quote where they were talking about a person's thinking being wrong,
Oh, yeah, that's coming up a little bit later.
and so they had the person talk to a loved one and say, I think this or I feel that.
Right.
And I feel unloved, like nobody loves me.
Yep.
And the person says back to them, "How foolish." I mean,
Yeah.
it's like that's right here.
Yeah.
Mock or validate
Yep.
someone's emotions. That is not the approach that someone
Yeah, I think that may have been in 6. I don't remember. I've got it marked as, wait a minute. Didn't you say not to do that? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, didn't you say not to do stuff like that?
Yeah, fair point. We're gonna come across that in a minute. All right. If anybody finds it, holler it. But yeah, you're correct. There is one place somewhere. Actually, it might be. Did you read outside of the assignment?
I may have.
I think it's a different. Caught ya. I actually think it's one of the other chapters about how to have the conversations with people that may come up. But yeah, so one of the things that does occur a few times in the text, and remember, we're always heading toward the Word of God. That ties pretty well with the sermon, right? Not the Word of Saunders, right? So we can disagree with his presentation. He's got degrees. It's an area of study, but there are some things he states that I don't fully agree with. And sometimes when he gives examples, it's like, wait a minute, there's a couple of Luther things too, where I'm like, dude, nuh-uh. But that happens a lot with Luther. I'm not used to it as much with Saunders. Yes. But with that, let's actually hold off until we get to the thinking one and the conversations. But you're correct in picking up on this, mocking someone's emotions or invalidating their emotions. Now, it's sort of funny the way he worded it. If you want to make someone feel bad, I don't think that was any of our goal, I hope. But his point is well taken in that regard anyway. Other thoughts with this conversation about emotions and how closely identified they are with who we are? Gary.
Just the fact of how much the intensity of those emotions do they, I mean, if something's mildly floating under the surface or something's jumping right out of the water at you. and
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it really just hits you in the head and
Yeah.
knocks you on your keister.
Yeah, so we can be very surprised by the intensity of our own emotions, and of course, even more so, others' emotions. We might feel the same thing, but to a different degree, and that's even if we're feeling the same thing. Yeah. Other thoughts with this passage about emotions? Christy?
I have a lot of issues with this
Okay.
personally.
I have a few as well, so go ahead.
And some of it will be discussed a little bit more when we get to the thinking, but it really struck me that he says, you know, our emotions are perhaps what most define us. And again, he says something very similar on page 34. Our feelings are immensely important. They define who we are.
Yep.
And so several times he contradicts himself, I think, a lot, because he says feelings then later are based on thinking, and thoughts can be wrong. But if our feelings are what define us, but our feelings are based on our thinking, isn't our thinking what defines us, not our feelings? So I have a lot of trouble with the logical part of that.
Yep.
And as a believer, especially as a Lutheran, I have some issues with our feelings and our emotions being what defines us, because I feel like my identity is in Christ, and that is something completely external to who I am. If I didn't have that, I don't know how you live without that. And
Right.
so I really, really struggle with that. That's how, that our emotions and our feelings are what define us. I just have a lot of issues with that.
Yes, agreed. I'm glad, because when we talked about this with elders, we had this exact same conversation. So I think, wishing to do fairness to the author here, I think as I read him and as I've reread him and prepared this, if I were his editor, I would switch the word define to differentiate. I think the point that he's trying to make, or at least the point that I think more wholeheartedly agree with, is our feelings are much more what makes us uniquely who we are. And that certainly would fit with his point. We have the same cells, we have the same bones. I mean, anybody who studies that knows there can be a fair bit of variety there, but we're all made up of the same organs and the same endocrinological systems and the same neurology and so forth. So what makes us unique is not, I have 2 arms, because so does everybody else in the room, right? There's your 2 arms, Isaiah. But how I feel about things, and it also blurs a little bit, and this is to your point, with how I think about things. But he even makes the point, sometimes we use those words a little interchangeably. Like, I feel like when what I actually mean is I think, or I think when what we actually mean is I feel. So yes, I agree with the concern there. I think where I can get more on board with it is that our emotions are more what differentiates us or individuates us from others. Because I'm sure we would not be able, among all of us, if we try to list it physiologically or in other ways, we would say, hey, we're all pretty much identical. But if we were to go through all the things that you do like and that you don't like and your feelings about various experiences, then we would start to differentiate quite a bit more. I think that's the point that he's making. If not, that's the point I would shift it to, and then I could agree with it. Other thoughts with that take, though? I do love anchoring our identity ultimately, though, in what Christ has done. And I don't think that's antithetical to what Saunders or certainly Luther would say. So I think he works against himself a little bit the way he has worded it. So Rob and then Carol. Yep.
Not to just super focus on this and make the whole session about it, but on top of what Christy's saying, and I think supporting that is, our beliefs make us, define us. And then also our individual experiences
Yep.
define us.
Yep.
Because we all walk a different path, even if we believe the same things. My experience from 0 to 61 is very different than everybody else's.
Yep.
And that can't help but define us. And sometimes that creates, feelings, sometimes that strengthens your beliefs, etc. So I think while we're picking apart his,
which is
his
fair.
statement,
This is- yep.
I'm just adding those couple of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Our beliefs, our experiences, our emotions, those are all part of, and of course, ultimately, we take our definition in who Christ has said that we are and what he's done for us. Carol, and then back up to Elijah.
Yeah, some of this language is hard to get around, in your head,
Yep.
in his definitions.
Yep.
But I think he's probably, he's a clinical psychologist, right? So
Yep.
he's trying to get at the point of how important emotion is.
Yep.
This whole milieu, right,
Yep.
how people are feeling, and then this deal about invalidating emotion. It's kind of like if somebody's really miserable about something, and you say to them, I'm not going to leave till you put a smile on your face. We've all had that
Good luck with that.
I want to see that smile.
Yeah, right, yep. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what he's getting at.
Yes.
Is there anything more hurtful than that?
Right, and I think often if we look at children's realities, we can see adult realities more starkly. So how often is a child very upset about something that we personally don't think is that important, and therefore we treat their upsetness as unimportant? They got a blue lollipop instead of a red lollipop, and you say, well, who cares? That doesn't matter. Well, they care, and to them it does matter, and so that emotion is important to deal with. Even if we can objectively prove that red dye number whatever is really no better for you than blue dye number whatever, and they really don't taste that different, it's not rooted necessarily in data, it's rooted in their experience. So we're going to have to find a balance, and these statements at first, and as we read through, I don't think he even goes as far as his statements seem to go, where we would just say whatever you feel, that's reality. He's gonna correct that as well, but validating rather than invalidating someone's emotional reaction, even though at some point it comes time to examine, is that emotion actually based in reality? Is that emotion, even if it's based in reality, a healthy one moving forward, or is it something you need to work to try to mitigate, or that sort of thing? So we'll get there. Elijah.
I just wanted to bring up, and this isn't what he's talking about, but I wanted to bring it up. The fact that I feel like one of the biggest differences between denominations is how much does emotion factor into salvation and belief and stuff. And I suppose Lutherans are probably characterized along the less emotional lines, as opposed to something like something charismatic or whatever.
Right.
But I still don't think it plays zero part in our spiritual life. I still think it has a pretty important part. So just that's another way in which I think emotion affects our identity.
Okay, and then how much our emotion has to do with our understanding of spiritual reality. Come back next week. We're going to talk about spiritual reality and mental health, not specifically drilling down on spirituality and emotion, but how spirituality and mental health both interact and are differentiated from one another. But agree with your point entirely. Helen, do you have? Yep.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more, and probably is advancing the conversation, but what I think is like, okay, the kid example is kind of easy, but it gets more complicated when we're dealing with adults who have real issues, and in their mind something happening is completely real to them.
Yep.
And it's not, but how we deal with it without getting upset, without feeling personally attacked,
Yeah.
without, still validating, but bringing that person to like, no, that's not it really.
Yes.
So, of course, I'm hoping we get
Yep.
it, but the point is how, yeah, for that person that is very real.
Yeah.
Even though we know it's not real, for that person is, so how to, and I know that would be very good for me personally to learn.
Yeah.
How to do it.
Well, I think one thing that illustrates your point of where somebody's emotional reality is their reality, even if that's not rooted in objective reality. Ever have a bad dream and wake up in a bad mood
Yeah.
based on something that didn't happen, right? But it doesn't change the fact that that's now the mood that I'm in, right? So my emotion is real, even though it's not based on reality. So how do we try to deal with that interplay is part of what we're gonna go into. Obviously, more common but more tricky is when you're dealing with someone else who's having a strong emotional reaction to something, and that really isn't the way that you see the situation. Is there a way to? So let's talk about. Let's continue with affect versus emotion, and then we'll continue to thinking, behavior, how they all interplay. So Marcus read already. Dan, you willing to read about affect, the second block quote?
Affect is a feeling at a particular moment. Mood is an emotion that endures. Affect is emotion from moment to moment, but usually returns to a mood. Affect that does not change or is inappropriate can be an indication of mental illness. Flat affect is the term to describe the inability to experience emotions. Inappropriate affect occurs when the felt or expressed emotion is in congruence with the situation.
Okay, so we're not going to dwell on this a whole lot, but at least in the clinical language, affect is how you feel right now. Mood is how you're feeling more overall, and then that would, your personality and so forth would be beyond that. So mood might be how you're doing this day or this week. Affect is how you're feeling in this exact moment. So you can have a moment of laughter in a really down week, or a moment of sadness in a really good week. And all of that is a little bit separate, I think, from just sort of natural demeanor or personality. Some people are by nature more likely to be glass half full optimists. Some people are more likely by nature to be glass half full pessimists. What did I see? I just saw the joke too about the engineer that just says the glass is only using half its capacity. Yeah. So, at any rate, I think recognizing the moment to moment versus the mood, I think it's just worth teasing out. Even for our own self-awareness. I'm grumpy. Am I having a grumpy day? Is it just a grumpy moment? That sort of thing. I think we'll be able to have a good conversation about emotions as we start to see their interaction with behavior and thinking as well. So if it's all right, or is it, okay if we keep a plug in here and the conversation's kind of staying in the same spot. We're just moving the ball forward a little bit. Tucci, would you be willing to read for us the quote there about behavior?
Behaviors are factions in trying to determine whether a person has a mental health problem. Clinicians will evaluate whether a person's behaviors are causing problems. Or behaviors causing pain in roles and relationships. This indicates a mental health.
And I would say this may indicate, we've all engaged in behaviors that have caused challenges in our roles or relationships. But if there's a pattern of doing so, and especially if that pattern is seeming inescapable, that's where there may be an indication here of a mental health challenge as well. But just obviously defining what behavior is, not as tricky to define as emotion, perhaps. If it's all right, let's get thinking out on the table as well, and then we'll continue on. Ken, would you like to read?
Okay. Thinking, cognitions. The most important mental activity is thinking. Many ways of thinking are referred to as cognitions. These include memories, assumptions, perceptions, expectations, plans, problem solving, and so forth. Mental health professionals evaluate a person's thinking in great detail in order to determine whether someone might have a mental health problem. In particular, they listen for negative thoughts since they essentially determine how someone feels and what someone does, which both affect how well we do in roles and relationships.
Okay, all right, so just defining thinking as differentiated from behavior or from emotion, from feeling or affect. He talks about the most important mental activity being thinking. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in chapter 6, so I'm not going to dwell on that and the different types of thinking that we naturally do, the way God has designed our brains to work. Any thoughts people want to discuss? We're going to get more about how this all interacts in just a minute. Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
Just ask one thing.
Yep, go ahead.
Your thoughts are on thinking when it talks about negative.
Yep.
is that just something that they do? Because what if somebody's like positive about everything, but it's, you know, I just kind of find that maybe over time they figure out there's a direct correlation between negative and mental health, but like when you take positive, one, is it real, and two, is it something that indicates an unrealistic, you know, look at themselves, you know?
Yeah.
That they're like the narcissistic type of like, I'm this and I'm a great planner and
Right.
all this positive stuff. I mean, how is the, I'm struggling a little bit with how just one side of the spectrum is what determines mental health.
Right, and here again, I think, what was that, Marcus? Go ahead.
Well, I don't think that's really exactly what he's saying, because he does say that it has to be congruent with reality.
Mm.
So if, whether you're thinking positively or you're thinking negatively, if it's not congruent with reality, there still is a problem. Right?
If I say I'm the greatest soprano soloist in the world, that should be a red flag to all of you, right? So if even a positive thought that's incongruent with reality. So yeah, I think that's part of it. But I do think your point is valid, which is, I think for the most part, professionals, and I'm not one of them, mental health professionals will be listening for these persistent negative tropes. However, I think a mental health professional is also going to spot if it seems like somebody's just always putting a rosy face. Like Carol used the example of the person, I'm not leaving till you smile. Why is this person so uncomfortable with tears? Why is this person so uncomfortable with negative emotion? Because that itself would be, again, just a little bit of a flag of, are we trying to cover something up? Are we trying to pretend? And that's where it could become incongruent with reality, you know, where it's, you know, trying to cheer up the person who's in the midst of grief is not helpful. I mean, the Proverbs talk about that, you know, how unpleasant that is, the joyful word in the midst of grief. You know, that also, I mean, I think an incongruent positive thought should also be a red flag too. And it's not like, I'm having a really crummy day, you must have a mental illness. That is a negative thought. You know, it's not, you know, it's listening for more a persistent and kind of unending, sort of chronic, that may definitely be more of a concern. Elijah.
Who's to say which ones are the congruent reactions and which ones are correspondent in reality and which ones aren't?
Right, and that becomes a challenge, and it also becomes a challenge, particularly if you're dealing with mental health illness like schizophrenia and so forth, where the ability to perceive what is reality, or psychosis, we talked about that a little bit last week too, where the person's perception of reality is not objectively verifiable, but that is what they're reacting to. So the person that, you know, the sort of imaginary person, you know, they think someone's there who's not there, and they're reacting to what that someone who's not there is doing, is something else to navigate. Obviously, if from a personal standpoint, if you're dealing with that, or if you're dealing with someone who's dealing with that, you need professional help. The good news is things like that do tend, from what I've read, to be pretty treatable medically, you know, pharmacologically pretty treatable, although the so-called chat therapy, you know, discussion and thinking about thinking and that sort of thing can still be helpful. But yeah, I mean, who's to say what is objectively true, particularly where it's an opinion about something? Is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Is it a big thing to be worried about or a small thing that you really shouldn't be that worried about? Some of that's got to be filtered through the person. Yeah. All right, so let's keep on trucking here. We're going to define roles and relationships. We're going to talk about the way they all interact, which is a lot of what we've been talking about already. Then we'll work out our definition for mental health versus mental health problem versus mental illness. All right, roles and relationships. Let's see, where had I ended? Dave, you're up. Go ahead.
Roles and relationships. Roles define our life's tasks, obligations, and responsibilities. All of us have many roles in life. Relationships are what most of us consider to be the most important and rewarding parts of our lives. Problems in developing or maintaining relationships can be due to mental health problems. Roles and relationships are closely intertwined. Most roles are defined by relationships. Mental health professionals evaluate how well a person is doing in roles and relationships to determine whether they might have a mental health problem. Someone having difficulty fulfilling role obligations or forming and maintaining loving relationships might have a mental health problem. impairment in either or both might be due to thoughts, behaviors, and feelings.
All right, so rather than the strictly internal, which we've been talking about so far, our emotions or affect, our thinking and cognitions, our behavior, which is at least observable, but is still our own, now we expand the circle a little bit to the others. What is our role in our relationship? By the way, what's the Lutheran word for roles in relationships that we've studied a lot of times? Vocation, right? So I think that would actually be a helpful term for him to introduce here. Our vocation, which could be the vocation of father or mother or husband or wife, that sort of thing, which is itself a relationship, but then also includes a role as well. It's just a dragonfly, so it's not going to bite anybody, just so you know.
There's another one stuck in the ceiling right there.
Oh, huh, interesting. Poor guy. So, excuse me. Just breathe some coffee.
I had it over there too.
Okay, so we've got all of our terms defined, but before we get to the definition itself, a lot of what we've already touched on, how blurry the lines are between these, especially in our own experience of life or other people's experience of life. So, continuing on, Gary, top on the page 6 there, the mutual influence of thoughts, behaviors, and feelings.
The thoughts, behaviors, and feelings determine one another. Our association between thinking and behavior is easy to recognize. We act according to our intentions, decisions, and choices. There are occasions when an adult's action cannot be attributed to intention, but these occasions are fortunately rare. Behaviors are a choice. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise. Sometimes anger or sadness gets the better of someone and leads them to do something they should not do. Generally, though, people act how they choose to act, whether they insist that their emotions are to blame or not. Example of a man who curses at his wife when angry, but not at his boss or at a police officer.
So I didn't quote the entire example, but that's the example he gives to sort of underline the point that he's making. What are people's thoughts about this particular approach? Go ahead, Danielle.
I think this is not true for everyone.
Okay.
And like he says, fortunately on the rarer side, but he kind of laid this out, how you have first the emotions, then the behavior, then the thinking, but in cases of extreme mental illness, all of those things kind of stack back. If you are building on a shaky foundation where your thoughts aren't correct, your feelings aren't based in reality, why would your actions be based in reality?
Right.
And I'm not saying that makes you not responsible.
Yep.
But that it doesn't necessarily follow that this person made a conscious choice to curse the police officer. Case in point being, plenty of people curse at police officers. It's not the point.
Right. Yeah, so I think, and just to clarify here, he's talking about when the systems are working the way they're supposed to work. So I think part of what you introduced was when these don't align is when you start to explore whether there may be some sort of mental health situation, because for most of us, you know, if you've got a beverage in front of you right now, I'm going to assume that's because you were thirsty, and then you acted on that feeling or experience of thirst, made a logical decision on the basis of that, and got yourself a beverage, right? And that can become a reflexive action, which we're going to talk about with chapter 6. But there's, for the most part, with most adult behavior, there is an alignment between what you're thinking and what you're feeling and how you're behaving, and any one of those three could be sort of the on-ramp to figuring out what somebody's current experience is. So for the most part, if somebody's lashing out in unexpected ways, then we're going to assume, say, hey, what's going on? Is something wrong? Did something happen? Because we're going to assume that it's just not a random firing of synapses that caused them to be angry. And then even then, somebody who's balanced enough or self-aware enough might just say, I don't know, but I'm just having an off day, versus just completely unpredictable outburst or that sort of thing where then you might start to wonder about mental health situations. So I think, at least for right now, he's describing when things are functioning the way they're supposed to function. And that's why I think it's actually helpful. At first, this behaviors are a choice sentence. It's only 4 words, but I'm like, oh, hold on. But then I realized every counter example I would use would probably fall under some sort of illness situation or mental health illness. So behaviors are a choice. Well, what about addictions? Well, addictions are their own thing. Behaviors are a choice. Well, what about those random outbursts? Well, those shouldn't be happening on a regular basis. If they are, then we might need to explore what might be causing that. But his example of a man who curses at his wife all the time when he's angry, but chooses not to do so with his boss, and then if the man's excuse was just, well, I can't help myself when I'm angry, that's just what I do, it's like, only in this setting, it's not what you do in any other setting. So some choosing has happened, even if it's become habit, which is what we're gonna get into in the next chapter. Christy?
This might be a little bit of a sideline, but how does, if we're taking his definitions as the fully functioning in reality person, that would have to be an adult, I would assume.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I said with adults, he did throw that in there
Oh, yeah,
somewhere,
yeah, an adult,
right?
okay.
Yep.
'Cause children and
Yeah.
teenagers, they're still developing.
Yep,
so-
correct. Yep, so the brains are still under construction. Yep, exactly, yep.
Yeah,
Ken?
everybody is up to like 25.
So my understanding is that, like, let's say back in my parents' day, or grandparents even, if you were physically healthy,
Yep,
you go to work.
right,
And that was the general consensus, shut up and go to work, right? And dealing with other stuff, you didn't talk to people, you
Yep.
kept your, whatever it is, your
Yep.
secrets to yourself, you kept things quiet, you didn't talk about that publicly or share that with anybody. And what I learned is, we're not just physical health, but we're physical health, we're mental health, we're emotional health.
Yep.
And we're spiritual health.
Yep.
And all of these elements combined make up our overall state of health. There has to be a balance.
Yep.
And that balance is never continuously on an even keel.
it's just like balancing on a boat, right?
So
The
we
boat
are-
moves.
We are sometimes closer to functional.
Yep.
And sometimes closer to dysfunctional.
Yep.
You know, and any one of those elements can be off.
Yep.
To some degree, some greater than others
Right.
sometimes.
Yep, agree 100%. We're this balance of our emotions, of our thinking, of our actions, of our spiritual reality. That's all in balance. And like I said, we're on a boat. So this boat of life changes, and the ability to balance, and every once in a while, an unexpected wave or wind throws things off for a little while, or that sort of
So
thing.
your
Yep.
thinking can change, and you
Yep.
can think about something a certain way, and that could affect your decision-making
Right.
process. So that's intellectual.
Yep.
It could be emotional.
And it can go the other direction. So that's some of what we're going to get into. Yeah.
It could be what your body is telling you, which is the physical. Or it could be something in your spiritual makeup, in the foundation of what you believe in.
Yep, absolutely. And they all interplay, and that's some of what we're going to talk about, especially with the cognitive and the behavioral chapters that are still coming. The way that what we think can change the way we behave, the way that we behave can change the way that we think or feel, all of that. Yep. Christy?
Ken brings up a point or a thought that I wonder at, and it's just a wonder, but, you know, this kind of came out in COVID a fair bit too. He's really just focusing on these three things, thoughts, behaviors, and emotions, and how those interact and create who we are. And so it almost implies that out of those three, the spiritual comes. But I would argue that spiritual is a fourth one. It's not something that's born out of our thoughts and emotions and behavior, because we are spiritual beings on a different level.
Right.
So I think that's just important, if that's correct, to remember that these aren't the only things that we are.
Right, and so what I can explain is that what he's doing is defining, because what we're working toward is understanding, and I believe it's the National Institute of Mental Health's definition of what constitutes mental illness. So, and that's why, like I said, we really haven't gotten to the Luther side of this. We haven't really gotten to the spiritual side of this. We're still understanding this from basically pretty much everything we're saying thus far in this chapter. Well, not every word would be agreed with, wouldn't be disagreed with by somebody coming from a secular standpoint on the basis of secularism versus religion. This is just trying to work our way toward what is a functioning current definition of mental health and mental illness. But we're then gonna need to add the spiritual layer as well. And in some ways, that is kind of fighting with your hand tied behind your back, because we believe, spiritual beings even prior to being physical beings, that takes priority and outlasts, in some ways, some of our physical realities. And so we are kind of coming at it backwards in a sense, but it's to land on a definition that's accepted sort of secularly and clinically. So again, not to be apologist for it, because I think there are things we can still disagree with, but just kind of keeping an eye on where we're at overall. Yeah, Carol,
Yeah, I think
and then back to Christine.
It's good, I think, to back into it and realize he's trying to define these terms, so when he gets around to what Luther wrote, hundreds of years before everybody started thinking about cognitive therapy,
Yep.
behavioral therapy, he's trying to lay the groundwork so that makes sense when he gets to it.
Yeah, and what becomes remarkable, even though I think in the grand scheme it could be kind of just an interesting side note, but what becomes remarkable is how instinctively and experientially Luther grasped what has become the medical consensus in regards to mental health. So much of Luther's personal advice, and sometimes advice in his sermons and writings and so forth, already aligned 500 years ago with what professional conclusions are now arriving at. But for right now, we're sort of letting the society set the terms, which is always a little bit of a gambit, but I think it does pay off eventually. Yep, we're good. Okay, well, let's read the next section here, because I think this will address some of the concern that we've had, and I know Christy made a reference to one of the quotes here that's upcoming. So let's see, is it Danielle next? Go ahead.
A distinction between thinking and emotions is extremely important, as it opens up the possibility of helping someone in emotional distress. At the same time, there is much modern misuse of the conflation of thoughts and feelings. Our feelings are immensely important. They define who we are. This has led to the absurd idea that feelings are always correct. Feelings are important and are to be understood, appreciated, and respected, but the modern notion that feelings are always correct has been terribly confusing and outright abused. The reality is that not every feeling is justified. Feelings are based on thinking, and thoughts can be wrong. The modern day hobby of asserting that any hurt feeling is evidence of maltreatment motivated by ill intent is detestable. Even though it might not work, we must continue to point to reality, point to facts, and point out errors in thinking. It will not often help, but adhering to the truth in all its forms is all we can do.
So it gets a little dire there for a little bit, but recognizing this challenge, let me just open it up before I editorialize. Thoughts on this particular quote? There are some ... so I had to cut a little bit out, but what are people's reactions to this? Yes, go ahead, Danielle, and then Elijah.
I can say this is true for myself, that when I am having kind of a, not great day, not great week, whatever, I have major depressive disorder, which is in remission thanks to medication. Very thankful for that. It comes and goes. It spikes, it dips. And when I'm having a bad day, having had enough up days, I now recognize I'm having a bad day. It's not going to be like this forever. And so at that point, I will start just reciting truth to myself until I can snap out of it, or until I start believing it, that, God loves me, God will not leave me, God will not forsake me. That's sometimes the only thing that is sort of the touchstone, like where is reality, where is the ground?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Go ahead, Marcus, and then we'll do Elijah. Yep.
100%.
I think part of the point he's making is that so many times, and I've run into this with Bethel school system, Bethel schools. They put this out that it doesn't matter what your feelings are, they're all valid, and they're all.
That's your truth.
That's your truth.
Yeah.
Whether it's true or not, objectively,
Right.
doesn't matter. That's the truth, and that's what you make it, and that's
Yeah.
really been a struggle that I've had with my daughters.
Yeah, I think, well, Elijah, you had a thought as well, and then we'll come back to that as well, too.
I just wanted to say, I think he's states it a little strongly, maybe he himself has a bit of a hurt feeling here, but,
Possible. It's possible.
But I think it's like totally right, like, I think, actually, I'm noticing among my generation especially, we've been so, like, taught, like, millions of times that, like, do what you feel, and all that actually becomes like this tyranny, like, you have to do what you feel, and it's like, I think people are actually, like, less free because they feel like they have to act according to every feeling, because that's what everybody's telling them.
Yep.
So I think I don't think he's wrong here, I just think he states it maybe.
He states it pretty boldly. That said, I agree. I don't think he's wrong that the best we can do. Now, he's going to talk a lot more, though he won't always embody it, to Bev's previous point, about ways that we can have these conversations that are perhaps more likely to be helpful than other ways that are more likely to be unhelpful. But I don't think he's wrong in saying that in a lot of these cases, we have to point to reality, we have to point up to facts, we have to point to the errors in the thinking, even if it doesn't end up helping. That's what we need to cling to. The gift, to Danielle's point, of knowing the anchor, back to Christy's point, of who we are in Christ, what God has revealed that exists outside of ourselves. So we're going to say the creed that's the same creed it was last week, no matter how I'm feeling this week. It's going to be the same creed next week. Well, technically it'll be the Apostles' Creed next week, but you know what I mean. It's the same belief, it's the same truth, regardless of my present experience of that truth or my present feelings about that truth. And so that, I think, is a huge leg up for a Christian worldview versus a postmodern worldview, now back to Marcus's point, that has been drilled home for decades of whatever you perceive is truth. Your truth, my truth, they don't have to be the same truth. And we're starting to see the fruit of that thinking over the course of generations, where the idea of an objective truth that exists outside myself, particularly if I find that truth in any way objectionable, actually isn't truth. That would be the very postmodern embodiment now that we're living with. And it wasn't by choice that I chose the name embodiment, but the body is where this is now having its starkest playing out. If you don't feel like your body is what your body ought to be, to someone of my generation, and I assume generations previous to me, it's like, but those are the body parts. I mean, it's kind of pretty clear. And to present day generations, like, no, that's not at all clear because that's not what I feel like. And as Elijah said, for a long time, the messages of children's entertainment are you can be whatever you want to be and whatever you feel like being, right? Even people who would have had no intention of applying that to something like transgenderism or something along those lines. But for so long, you create your own truth, you create your own reality. I think we're just seeing some of the fruition of that. My hope is that the way that pendulums swing, it will also swing back. My hope is that it doesn't swing back by crashing too hard and the lives that it will cost in the process. Bev, go ahead.
So part of my problem with that, maybe what you're seeing in school, is that it's not, the pendulum doesn't stop with your truth is your truth and your truth is your
Right.
truth, but everybody else has to buy into your truth and your
Right.
truth, whether you disagree with it or not.
And whether they contradict or not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so which truth are we operating in right now?
And I'm not finding it here, but he does talk about how people use their own truths to justify their own hate.
Yep. Yep, he addresses that in a couple of different places, I think. And also, I know even if it's not to the level of hate, he uses several examples of when people choose to interpret something based on the way they've perceived it, rather than on, being willing to dig back and figure out if that was the actual intent. So I don't remember the specifics, but somebody gets rebuked at work and they decide this person has it in for me, rather than just they had made a mistake and needed to be called out, and maybe that person was having a bad day too, so it ended up being a little sharper than it was supposed to be or something, and instead they conclude this person has it in for me or something like that. It's funny to me. This may have always been true, but I get a chance to interact with confirmands especially a lot, so I'll talk to them about their favorite classes and everything. But every time, what's the reason given if someone's doing badly in a class? It's almost universally, if someone's doing badly in a class, teacher doesn't like me. So that's why they put that question on there that you got the wrong answer to, huh? You know, but that's the interpretive lens. Now, like I said, that may not be unique to postmodernism, but it does create an interesting dynamic. Would be an example of this putting an overlay on reality and then reacting to the overlay rather than to the reality. The chances that teachers actually dislike everybody, I've been a teacher, I've had to fail people that I'd liked. I would have liked if they'd studied more so I didn't have to fail them. But that sort of thing, our acting on our perception instead of our reality. All right, so what we've done, and I want to keep us trucking here on a time. Yeah, go ahead, Brenda.
Thinking back to my own childhood and the responsibilities we had as students and the respect we had for teachers. If you did something wrong, your parents said, you did something wrong, you're gonna be punished.
Right.
Whereas in today's world, the parent tells the teacher, you did something wrong.
Yeah, it's the teacher that gets the talking to.
There's
Yeah.
something wrong with the way things have turned around.
Yep.
And that's part of it. And so children now think that they have all this power that really they haven't earned because they haven't lived long enough to know
Right.
what power is and how to use it.
Right.
And that frustrates me. And when I hear Marcus talk about his daughters
Yeah.
and how everybody's a victim. Everybody's a victim, but nobody's accountable, nobody has responsibility for their own actions and behavior. And I think that's where our society fails us all. Because now we older people look at these young people and think, what happened to you? Why do you not respect yourself and other people? Where did we go wrong? How did we fail you? And I think Elijah talks about, it's because we have to express our true feelings, whether they're the truth or the
Right.
person's truth. How do we get back to the truth?
Yeah.
It's all subjective now.
Yeah, and I think that is the danger, and so I think it creates a challenge, and I think this would be probably a topic for another full session, but I think it creates a challenge in the mental health field. I'd want mental health professionals to weigh in on this, because they issue new DSMs, and all of a sudden things that used to be indications of mental health problems are now not. Those are normal things, et cetera. So you do, yeah, so I think we're limited as long as we try to stay within the secular realm. But let's get to the definition here. We have to stay pretty much in the secular realm this time, but we're almost entirely in the spiritual realm next time. So make sure you don't miss next week. All right, so let's go ahead though. Let's see. Danielle just read. So Sandy, would you be willing to read defining mental health problems, and mental illness?
A mentally healthy person thinks accurately and realistically, feels much this way he or she wants, and is in control of his or her actions. As a result, the person is able to fulfill roles and make and keep important relationships. The DSM, published by the American Psychiatric Association, specifies the criteria for various mental illnesses. According to the DSM, a person has a mental illness if he or she experiences intense distress or exhibits impairment in roles and relationships because of problems in thinking, behavior, and feeling. Cognitive behavior therapy focuses on changing cognitions and behaviors so that the person feels better and does better in his or her roles and relationships. As we will see, Luther advised cognitive behavior interventions 100 years before.
Oh, 5, not give. Typo. 500 years.
Given hundreds of years before call.
All right, 500 years instead of give, my bad. All right, so now you can see the DSM's definition of what a mental illness is. Intense distress or exhibits impairment in roles and relationships, so that's why we defined what roles and relationships are, because of problems in thinking, behavior, and feeling. So that's why we defined what each one of those were. So again, we're still dealing within the secular realm, and as we pointed out, there's going to be limitations to that because that only looks at a portion of the picture. However, we at least understand what they're referring to when they make this point. If your thinking, behavior, or emotions are such that they're impairing your ability to function in your role or your relationship, then you may have some sort of definable mental illness. Now, of course, the challenge that we've already touched on is what do we perceive as our role and what do we perceive as healthy relationships? That's going to be an area where we as Christians may come to a different conclusion than the authors of the DSM or any other practitioner might. However, at least we're all dealing in the same terms now and approaching it with the same framework. Elijah.
Well, maybe it's just me, but especially that first sentence, if you look at that, I think everybody I know has a mental illness.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you all know how he thinks about you, yeah. Yeah. So, but this is actually valid and goes back to last week's point that Dave was presenting, which I think is really good, that we should not think of these as three separate bins, where you've got mental health and you're either in that bin or you're in the bin of having a mental health problem, or in the most extreme, you're in the bin of having a mental illness, but as a continuum. And these are sort of waypoints on a spectrum. So perfect mental health would be defined this way, but none of us exhibit this all the time, right? Some of us exhibit it almost never. But that's what mental health would be defined as, when your thinking and your behavior and your feelings align with reality and are not inhibiting your ability to function in your roles and relationships. If you may have some impairment to extreme impairment, then you're going to start to look through the possibility of mental health problems or even diagnosable mental illness. But remember the question that he recommended last week that I really recommend as well. The question isn't, is this a mental illness? The question is, does this person need help? That's a much better question, because somebody who would still qualify as mentally healthy could still need help. Someone who's dealing with a mental health problem could need help. Someone with a mental illness does need help. But I think it's a much more helpful question than just how do we define it or what category would we put this person in. I think if we succumb to that thinking, we would succumb to the same concern we had about the diagnostic thing, where you'd say, well, you got to have 5 out of 9 to count as having depression, and you've only got 4, so you're fine. And that's not the way we would want to approach that. Daniel.
Kind of to Elijah's point, Elijah, you don't know anybody who is not a sinner.
Yeah.
In a fallen body, in a fallen world.
Yes, yeah, correct. So Christ is the only one perfectly mentally healthy. Of course, they put him to death. So, Ken.
Also in reference to Elijah's comment, God does not make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And in spite of our shortcomings, loves each and every one of us. And I wonder what he would define these imbalances as
Right.
himself.
Yep. And so we have to balance two things. God doesn't make mistakes, but we do live in a fallen world. So God didn't, I used the example last week a number of times, but if you have high blood pressure, did God make a mistake making you? Or you're just fact of living in a fallen body in a fallen world? You could have inherited that though. Like when we first started testing cholesterol was when I was a kid. I had higher cholesterol than the rest of my family combined. I ate the same diet, it just genetically, somehow, I got unlucky and had the high cholesterol. Did God make a mistake? I don't think of it in that way, but I'd be making a mistake not to be aware of it and not to try to counteract it, right? So I think that's the balance we're trying to find. For the sake of time, I'm going to dive us through chapter 6 because it's going to introduce another way of approaching this. This is based on a book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, and I can tell you the book is a little on the slow side. However, very worthwhile. And so I had read this a number of years ago, and it was neat to see it come up again because I think it is a very helpful way to think about thinking. The word think just got used a lot in that sentence. But I'm just going to read through this. We're taking this in bulk, and then let's talk about it, the whole thing. So you're going to hear me for a little while here. Thoughts and behaviors are learned. We intentionally teach children some thoughts and behaviors. Many important things that children learn are neither taught nor learned intentionally. Children are born ready to learn about love, for instance. Children instinctively learn about themselves and about others and relationships. They learn from experience whether they are considered lovable and worth attention. They learn whether others can be trusted to take care of them. Something to trust or not to trust. Oh, that. Not you're annoyed with that, to trust or not to trust, that loving relationships are possible. Continuing on here. So some thoughts and behaviors become habitual to the extent that they happen automatically and essentially disappear from awareness. We know from research by cognitive psychologists that these habits are necessary for day-to-day functioning. Example I usually use is brushing your teeth. Does anybody really every morning think through how should I brush my teeth? Where is my toothbrush? Where is the toothpaste? Only if you've lost it do those questions come up, right? I mean, lost the toothbrush and the toothpaste. Otherwise, you kind of do it on autopilot, right? If you drive to work every day, you drive to work every day, and you don't have to keep thinking about where to turn, unless, say, there's an accident or major traffic, in which case you might pick a different route. So the things that we do over and over again, we start to do them so habitually that we do them without thinking about them. If you're ever in for a little challenge to your self-esteem, ask your closest loved ones what some of your most annoying tics are, or some of the phrases that you unknowingly use all the time, or that sort of thing, because we all do it. All right, so this illuminates, picking up, I had to stop partway through the quote there. This illuminates the difference between two thinking systems as described by cognitive psychologist Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And what I can say from some of the other neurology reading that I did is they actually happen in parallel systems in the brain. So it's actually physically happening in different parts of the brain, simultaneously, all at the same time. I can really geek out about God's design for us in this regard. But let's carry on so you know at least what he's talking about. So, slow thinking. The slow thinking system is deliberate. This type of thinking requires effort and attention. When learning a new skill, we must concentrate on what we are doing, engaging our slow thinking system. The decision of buying a house should be a slow thinking system, not the sort of thing you should just drive past and say, I'm buying that house, right? So there's slow thinking. This doesn't mean you're slow in the older sense of the word, that you're challenged in your ability to think. This is just the deliberative thinking. This is the thinking you know you're doing. This is the thinking where you say, I need to think about that. That's slow thinking. Most of what we think of as thinking is slow thinking. Fast thinking, we get a longer definition here because it's the thinking we don't think about. Much of our cognitive activity entails much faster, practically automatic thinking. When engaged in fast thinking, we think and engage in certain behaviors with minimal attention or effort. Fast thinking capacity develops with experience. The fast system is almost completely involuntary. Fast thinking applies to behavior as well. Over time, with repetition and learning, many skills move from the slow, deliberate system to the fast system. In this way, sophisticated behaviors can become habitual. After a certain amount of experience, we can make coffee, type, or drive a car with little or no cognitive effort. But think about how much is involved. And any of you have taught someone else, for instance, how many of you in the room have taught someone else how to drive? And you realize how many steps are involved in that which we often do while eating breakfast, talking on our phone, and perhaps shaving or brushing our teeth. I've seen all those happen on morning commutes before. Very, very complicated activity that can become second nature. Put another way, fast thinking is knowing. I know how to drive a car, how to type, how to read. In a very real sense then, fast thinking is not thinking at all, but rather simply reacting based on what we have learned and now know. So fast thinking versus slow thinking. I'm going to bring this to the bottom of the page and then we can discuss. Slow, deliberate thinking can be wrong. Even if we put effort into our choices and decisions, we can still make mistakes. Overall, however, when we engage in slow thinking, we are much more likely to realize our own thinking problems and errors. Inaccurate fast thinking is much more likely and thus much more common. In similar fashion, habits of behavior can be quite unhealthy. Importantly, if someone's fast thinking is inaccurate, he or she is unlikely to realize it unless it is pointed out. In the same way, bad habits can become so ingrained that their negative effect on health is no longer appreciated. Whether fast, automatic, or slow, deliberate, thinking can be inaccurate. Whether intentional or habitual, behaviors can be unhealthy. Fast thinking is not easily recognized as inaccurate, and behavioral habits are not always seen as unhealthy. What are people's thoughts? That's a whole page worth of text. I don't know if it's an idea you've ever come across before. What are people's thoughts? Bev?
If I could put it in the music realm.
Yep.
You'll appreciate this. And I think almost every organist would say this, that we have a piece that we've played for decades, and then one day we just have a problem with a certain passage. So we stop, take the time, break it down, play it very slowly, voice by voice, only to discover we've been playing it wrong for 30 minutes. That there was a held note or a sharp or something that we just didn't see. And because we've been playing it so long, we don't really think about it. We just play it
Just do it, right?
until one day it breaks.
Yeah.
And then we find the error.
Oops.
Oops.
Autopilot is the phrase sometimes. Yeah, Brenda.
I was gonna equate it to dance. The same
Okay.
idea came to my mind.
Yep.
Because we talk about muscle memory.
Yes.
And automatic pilot is basically what
Yep.
that is. And when you're learning a new step or a complicated pattern, it's a struggle. And you have to really break it down and do it piece by piece. It's like the alphabet, you're putting together a word and you've got to find the right letters. And I'm thinking, but once you get it, it becomes automatic and it becomes muscle memory. And I think that's true of all behavior. Anything that's automatic is something you do routinely, habitually, and without thinking. And I remember learning that in a psychology class in college about how you have the automatic behavior, and then you have the behaviors where you have to be cognitively involved in thinking through a major decision, the pros and the cons, et
Yep.
cetera. So I had a similar thought that you had.
Well, my thing is, you know, like, when I stopped working, people thought that I had all kinds of weird diseases, and blah, 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 and I'm not like, no, it's a break. Yeah.
Other
It's a
thoughts?
break from being
Dave.
a provider all my life.
I think that.
I need that, I say I need to recharge, is what I say, need to recharge.
Need to recharge sometimes. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Fast thinking can get into trouble when you see something and you react to it. And the response can be it could be an appropriate response, but maybe the way you're saying something or reacting to something can be hurtful.
Yep.
And the instinct, or at least the response is to immediately do that before you necessarily know what's going on, what the facts are, what the circumstances are.
Yep.
So you gotta slow things down with that.
Yeah. Anybody ever lived somewhere where your clock got moved? The clock that used to be on the wall there?
Oh, yeah.
How many times do you look to where the clock isn't anymore, right? Or any similar scenario where something familiar, and that's when you realize this is this fast thinking, the assumption. And we do it with our behaviors, we can do it with our tone, we can do it with, and not realizing that can become a real challenge. Just a couple more, we're at 12:30, so I don't want to prolong it much longer.
I
Elijah?
miss the bell, like John's mom passing them on, she used to bell like from the entrance of the door.
Oh, gotcha. Elijah's gonna share something with us right now.
Well, it's just this one passage at the bottom of 6, page 6, not chapter 6.
Yeah.
That we skipped.
Yeah, because it was really recapping some of last week. Sorry, I didn't mention that I was
wasn't
skipping
here
it.
last week.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead though. What do you got?
Well, I just wanted to cover it because I don't agree with it, actually. The second paragraph here, do you want me to just read it?
The society having particular, go ahead.
The
Yep.
society has very particular and derogatory ideas about mental illness. The common belief is that persons with mental illness are dangerous and unpredictable. Another idea is that a person with mental illness must deserve it. Some people believe that mental health problems happen only to the weak. Strong people fight through it and tough it out. It is likewise unfortunately common to think that parents and families are to blame for mental illness in children. I don't know if this is a different generation thing, because I have never seen any of this, except for the last one. It is very common to think that parents and families are to blame, but I think often they are.
Okay, so, but I think what would be interesting would be this. Elijah's saying.
No.
Just wait. Just wait, yeah. Family situations can have contributed to mental health.
I think that's like the most common,
Yeah, yes. The adverse childhood experiences we talked about last week too. Yeah, no, you're on point with that. What would be interesting to me would be if we compared, because I think that yours is about the first generation for whom this paragraph would not be true. Because raise your hand if this was not, if everything that's in this paragraph was absolutely true for you when you were growing up. That mental health was seen as being a sign of weakness, all that stuff. Ken, you were referencing this before as well. So I think we've made a lot of progress in that regard. Whether the pendulum has gone so far, we talked about this a little bit last week too, so you're at a disadvantage of just assuming every bad feeling is a mental illness or every bad day is a mental illness. And that's not to lampoon it. It is the idea of, everything can be diagnosed and then perhaps even dismissed. I think it's dangerous to stigmatize, it's dangerous to normalize too much, to the place where it becomes commonplace and not something toward which we either bring serious attention or compassion. Yeah, you have a mental illness, everybody has a mental illness, I don't care about your mental illness, would be swinging back to the unhelpful. Christy, you had a hand up too? No. So we're at 12:35. I'm always happy to talk longer, but I recognize that we've got more coming. And some of what we're still uneasy about is what's still going to be addressed. So next week, we're going to talk about spiritual distress but how distinguishing spiritual distress from mental health illnesses, the way they can interplay with one another, but the way they're not identical, and one does not necessarily indicate the presence of the other. So Dan's going to be presenting on that. I've got the material here. However, one thing you're going to be at a big disadvantage. This is a handout. So if you've already read the text, he made reference to this Anfechtung, and then does very little to define it or anything like that, and you probably would have felt like, what's he talking about? This is one of the greatest places where Luther addresses this, and so this is the preface to his German writings. It's the introduction. Not all of it is about that, but it's only a couple of pages, and by the way, if you've never read Luther, Luther is always lively. But this is only 6 pages or so, and worth your time. It'll give you a much better insight into what Luther's talking about with Anfechtung than whatever chapter that is, 5, than chapter 5 by itself would have. Also want to mention there are some chapters that I'm just not going over at all. Chapter 3 about the medico-historical context of Luther's advice is interesting. If that's an area that interests you, we can still fruitfully have the conversations we're having without making any reference to it at all. It'll mostly highlight how different Luther's approach was than from the medical professionals at his time. Okay, fine, that's interesting, but it's not something we're going to spend a lot of time discussing. So we're not discussing 3 at all. 4 is really about pastoral care, so feel free to look at it, keep me accountable, kind of like the sermon, right? But it's not something we're going to spend some of our time in class talking about. So that's why we're skipping down to 5. But even in order to make much sense of 5, I think this will help you a lot. And next week, we're probably going to spend more time on this than we are on chapter 5, but we'll bring Saunders' views into the discussion as well. So make sure you grab these. If you wish, this is the little Cliff Notes handout for next week. I'll have this. This is the right number of pages too. I double checked. So feel free to grab one of these as well. All of it's online too. So let me close this off with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the chance to spend time together in fruitful conversation, trying to understand better your creation, of which we are a part, and how you have designed us to function, how sin has affected those functions and continues to affect those functions, so that we can be better informed about ourselves, better able to care for and love and be compassionate towards others. I thank you for each person here, those joining us online. Pray that you would be with John and Lene and Kevin as they're taking care of the needs that they need to take care of down in Virginia. And pray that you would be with each of us this week. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right, thanks so much, everybody. Yeah. Yeah. You all right? Was it an injury or just sat too long?
Kathy making a criminal gesture. I'm walking around like this.
Yeah. I was turning